Back in 2022, when Russia launched its attempt to try and take Kyiv, it used conventional armoured thrust that wouldn't have looked out of place in the Second World War.
It wasn't long before the soundtrack of the war in Ukraine changed. What you're hearing is the buzzing of drones, the subject of this episode. We are talking about drones because of how they've completely changed the battlefield.
The Ukrainian officials always emphasize that this war is a war of technology, it's a war of brains, essentially.
The Russians have been using the Shahed 136 drones, and that looks a bit like a scaled-up version of a paper dart you might make.
These drones are notorious in Kiev, for example, where they're called moped or lawnmower because of the distinctive sound that they make.
And it was Shahed drones launched by Tehran a week ago in Iran's first ever direct attack on Israel.
Ukraine has been using the Turkish-made Bayraktar drone, which has become a totem, if you like.
The Bayraktars gave Kyiv an edge in the first months of the war. They have earned a special place in Ukrainian hearts.
Some Ukrainians have even named their babies Bayraktar to honor the Turkish drone, and Javelina in honor of the missile system.
Elsewhere in the Sahel, they have a mixed reputation.
Unfortunately, these drones have also been harmful to the populations. The military governments don't talk about civilian death.
I'm Krassi Twig, and this is the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring, looking at the world through the lens of its media.
Радио Tehran. Мы не вторгались на территорию Украины.
Western countries are not the international community. That era has finished.
My colleague Tim Bowler, who is a defense and aerospace expert, has been following developments in warfare technology. He saw his first drone as a teenager back in 1976, and that left an impression.
At Farnborough, which is one of Europe's biggest aerospace shows, the drone was something called the Western Wisp. If you can imagine a slightly squashed beach ball with two sets of rotor blades above, four spindly legs and a tiny camera underneath, that's it. I wasn't very impressed, to be honest.
Drones have come a long way since that squashed beach ball Tim saw. They are now considered the next big thing in modern warfare. But before we explore that, let's have a bit of history, because developing the idea goes back a long way.
Austrians were experimenting with remote-controlled balloons in the latter half of the 19th century. And then in the First World War, people are developing remote-controlled biplanes. Now, they don't go anywhere because the technology is still in its infancy. But then in the 20s and 30s, people develop these remote-controlled aircraft basically as targets for gunners to practice shooting at. And then in the 1930s, Britain develops this particular plane that it calls the Queen Bee.
Catapulted from HMS Neptune into the sky to fly without a pilot, naval gunners use the famous robot plane, the Queen Bee, as a real target.
And it's probably from the name Queen Bee that we then get the word drone, the male bees in a hive that applies to all these unmanned, unpiloted aircraft. And the first mention I can see of the word drone in the media is about 1946.
So they were first used as practice for targets, and now, of course, they are finding the targets and destroying those targets. How did they develop as weapons?
It's really 9/11 that transforms things. Drones had been used as reconnaissance vehicles by the Americans in the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s. But then with the miniaturization of technology and the development of smaller, lightweight missiles, the Americans started sticking these missiles on a drone that's called the Predator, which is really the first attack drone, and they used it for counterinsurgency warfare in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then its successor, called the Reaper, can carry almost as many bombs and missiles as a conventional fighter jet. And those names, Predator, Reaper, they explicitly tell you what they're about. They're chosen very deliberately. And just more recently, in 2020, a Reaper drone was used for the missile attack that killed the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani outside Baghdad airport. For a brief period, it was mainly the US plus Israel which had these attack drones, but that era has now well and truly passed.
And now we hear about drones being used in several current wars in Ukraine and in Gaza. Can you give me a picture about how widely they're being used around the world now?
Well, I reckon there are about 35 countries that can now operate these sophisticated attack drones like the Reaper or Turkey's Bayraktar drone, and more than 100 countries are operating much simpler, cheaper models, and a significant number of countries such as Turkey, Iran, developing their own drone industries, and they're being used around the globe.
As you'd expect from the global jigsaw, we will look at our subject from several different angles to connect dots with the geopolitics. But let's stick with the tech for now to understand why it's so attractive in the military field.
They can do a lot of things much more cheaply than a conventional aircraft with a pilot in them. So you save a lot of money, you save on risk. There's no pilot to be captured or killed. And they can be used for reconnaissance and surveillance, most obviously, spotting your opponent's moves on the battlefield. They give you a real-time feed of data and information, which is key. There's command and control, allowing commanders to communicate more effectively with their units in the field, directly attacking enemy forces, guiding other weapons onto a target, electronic warfare, disrupting your opponent's communications, and even logistics, delivering supplies to units in hard-to-reach places. They're key to what the military like to call the networked battlefield, where all your units are talking to each other at the same time, rather than traditionally going hierarchically up and down a chain of command. Information can get to those who need it much more quickly. And of course, these things come in all shapes and sizes: fixed wing, single rotor, multi-rotor, and as we said, some are the size of conventional aircraft, and others are tiny handheld drones built out of cardboard and thrown into the sky by frontline soldiers.
So they're cheap, easy to assemble, no big deal if you lose them. They're very nimble and hard to remove. How do you defend against drones?
Well, you can do it passively by camouflaging your troops and your equipment so they can't be easily seen. You can disperse your forces widely over a battlefield so they make less tempting targets. Or, yes, you can try and shoot them down with bullets, rockets, or similar. Ukraine's been using anti-aircraft tanks. But the other challenge is that they're hard to see on radar because they fly very slowly, and most conventional radars are set to pick up fast-moving aircraft. They're small, they don't give out much heat, so they don't show up much on the infrared.
Let's go back to Ukraine to understand how the mass use of drones has changed the way the war is being fought.
Now what we have is a widely dispersed battlefield with both defenders and attackers spread very thinly in a way we haven't seen in conventional warfare before. Drones favour the defence, and if you think of massive tank attacks in World War II where armies would use tanks to try and force their way through and surround the other side, that's much harder to do now because your opponent can retaliate much more quickly and shell you if you're doing that. There's a good old-fashioned military phrase, shoot and scoot, which says as soon as you've fired, you need to disappear and shift your position because your enemy will shell your original position. Drones make that gap between you firing and the enemy firing back at you much, much tighter.
Tim mentioned Turkish and Iranian drones earlier. They're part of the arms race between Russia and Ukraine, and Iran used hundreds of them in its unprecedented attack on Israel in mid-April.
The Russians have been using the Shahed 136 drones in the conflict, and that looks a bit like a scaled-up version of a paper dart you might make with a pusher propeller at the back. It's about 2.5 meters wide and fly for 2,500 kilometers. It costs about $20,000 and will carry up to a 50-kilogram warhead. So it's very cost-effective for Russia in using these against power stations or docks.
Barry Sadid from our Iran team is going to give us Tehran's perspective on the Shahed drones, starting with the price tag.
If we're to believe these leaked documents posted online by a Russian hacker group, Moscow's actually signed a $1.75 billion contract for about 6,000 Iranian Shahid drones, which would come to slightly under $200,000 per drone, which is not bad considering the estimated about $20,000 production cost. Iran sees itself and Russia as being allies under sanctions. It's Iran's way of cultivating a non-Western coalition which can survive economically outside of the long arm of the US Treasury. And so Russia is reportedly giving this money in the form of gold bullion to Iran.
You heard a lot of reportedly and leaked there, because the official narrative is somewhat different. Even the sale of drones itself is disputed.
Iran has consistently denied supplying drones specifically for the use of Russia's war in Ukraine. In terms of its official diplomatic position, it's always been against the war, for a negotiated solution to the conflict, albeit blaming NATO for starting the war in the first place by encroaching on Russia's sphere of influence. But what it does acknowledge is that perhaps a small number of drones were supplied to Russia before the war, which could explain the images of Iranian drones being shot down. But in practice, Iran has effectively sided with Russia, and we see that through its supply of drones. The drones which Iran supplies are actually rebranded by Russia as the Giran 2. Russia developed an actual production plant in Tatarstan.
Tehran's denials that it supplies the technology to Moscow are somewhat undermined by the praise of Iran's drones, dished out by the Supreme Leader's favorite daily.
We've seen some glimpses of admission in the hardline media in particular. In the hardline daily Kayhan, they published an editorial boasting about the use of Iranian drones against NATO in Ukraine. The Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, boasted about their prowess and the notoriety that the drones have gained thanks to reporting by Western media, and has used that to strengthen its relationships with various countries. So now we're seeing Sudan is coming in perhaps as a customer, previously Ethiopia, Bolivia, Venezuela, even non-state actors like the Polisario Front in Western Sahara. So the irony is that we're seeing Iran's international isolation from the past forcing it to produce this comparative advantage, which is now enabling it to reap the rewards in terms of strengthened relations through the export of these well-developed arms.
Before we move on to another notable drone-producing country, there's curious history about how Iran got into developing drones in the first place.
The story of Iranian drones really begins in the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s. After the Islamic Revolution, Iran goes overnight from being a darling of the West, well-funded, well-supplied with American weapons, to being an international pariah. And it's locked in conflict with Iraq, which is relatively better connected on the international scene. When it comes to its air force, for example, Iran, it's supplied with these American fighter jets like the F-14, but it's unable to actually secure the replacement parts. So instead, it focuses on asymmetric warfare. And in terms of its air force, it means the development of drones.
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. The other country that's made an impact in this major war in Europe with its drones is Turkey. Ukraine's been using the Bayraktar drones from the start of the war, and they've been so appreciated, they've entered popular culture. The Bayraktar drones have even become part of the family. Here's Margarita Malyukova from our Kyiv team.
Some Ukrainians have even named their babies Bayraktar to honor the Turkish drone, and Javelina in honor of the missile system.
True love there. And we will be back to Margarita in a bit, but first, let's examine the appeal of the Bayraktars with Tim.
They're proper unmanned aerial vehicles. They cost about $5 million apiece. Not as much as, shall we say, a Reaper drone, which costs $35 million, but much more sophisticated than the £20,000 Shahid drones that the Russians have been using. So they can linger a long time over the battlefield. And they've been used not just in Ukraine, in Libya, Syria, and between Azerbaijan and Armenia.
Time to introduce another colleague to explain Turkey's drone diplomacy, Hilken Boran.
Turkey is not officially involved in the conflicts in Ukraine or in the Sahel region, but Ukraine and certain Western African nations have bought Baykar-made drones and are using them. Turkey does not have a say or any preconditions on the sale of or utilization of these drones, and Baykar is a private defense company. It is owned by President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's son-in-law, Selçuk Bayraktar, and his brother, Haluk Bayraktar. So Selçuk Bayraktar is the chief technology officer, and Haluk Bayraktar is the CEO, the chief executive officer of the company. In the Ukraine case, for example, both Selçuk Bayraktar and Haluk Bayraktar have recently said that they would begin constructing a new drone factory in Kiev. They said this during a defense expo in Saudi Arabia, which is another country that Bayraktar has signed deals for joint production of drones. As for Sahel, sales to Burkina Faso and Mali have made headlines recently, and the Turkish media also closely covered, in one instance in Burkina Faso, how the armed forces used the drones to repel this mass attack by militants.
This successful private enterprise seems to do the state's bidding in a few places around the world. Its links to the president have raised questions in Turkey.
Some critics say the defense giant Baykar was catapulted to fame and success due to its close ties to President Erdogan's government, and that it received funds from the Turkish state in the process. But both Bayraktar brothers and President Erdogan himself have repeatedly denied these claims. So Selçuk Bayraktar is a celebrity almost. He's a very popular figure in Turkey.
We have produced 6-ton Akıncı, which is only produced by 3 or 4 countries in the world, and Bayraktar TB2 is the most famous drone in the world.
He frequently gives interviews to pro-government outlets. He attends these youth technology festivals, and he almost always touts Baykar's newest projects in these festivals and in these media appearances that he does. So there's an overwhelming positive perception presented as somehow Turkey's success and the source of national pride.
Türk mühendis ve teknisyenlerin çalışmasının ürünü olan insansız hava aracı Bayraktar göreve...
And I have to say at this point that the TB2 Bayraktars are generally referred to as domestic and national drones because Turkey feels this necessity to distinguish its domestic defense technology versus the ones that it imports from abroad, especially issues with the US and the recent problems it had trying to acquire F-16 fighter jets have led Turkey to this more domestic-oriented approach.
So the media is loving the story. And how is it going down with the public?
Obviously, the success of Baykar and Turkey's quote-unquote drone diplomacy is generally received positively by the public, and that these are homegrown drones, if you will, that are making a name for themselves out across the world. So the perception is overwhelmingly positive.
What's the view from those on the receiving end in West Africa? Lynette Bahati, one of the Sahel analysts in our Nairobi bureau, looked into what the Bayraktar drones are doing in the region.
In Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso, these drones have really been supporting the fight against militant groups. And especially when we watch the state television, we've been seeing operations being conducted. For example, Keletigi Operation Chifari in Burkina Faso. These drones are used to track down militant groups. They're used in the reconnaissance missions by the armies in these countries, and especially after the withdrawal of the French forces from the Sahel.
And have they been used purely for reconnaissance purposes? Has there been any harm for civilians, and has that been covered?
The military is using them in their counter-insurgency operations to track down these militants. Unfortunately, these drones have also been harmful to the populations. But of course, the military governments, when they report about these operations, they say militants are the ones who have been killed. They don't talk about civilian deaths. In Burkina Faso,
figurent des hélicoptères de combat et des drones de frappe et de contrôle de l'espace.
The main news bulletin in the evening talking about army operations. Militants are being killed. We also have civilians being killed. And these reports are not coming out from the government or the state TV talking about them. We get them from civil society organizations or just when monitoring social media. And when you look at the numbers of civilians who have been killed, they're quite significant. In Zango, this is where about 100 civilians were killed. And then around Djibo, we had about 300 civilians being killed. For the Malian army, for the Malian government, when they kill people in these operations, they have killed militants. They have not killed any civilians. So it's very rare to see Malian army acknowledging that they have killed civilians. In Niger, we have an instance where civilians were killed. About over 50 were killed. They acknowledged, but then they did not give the number of casualties. They just said, yes, civilians were killed in this area. In November last year, 2023,
the Malian army announced on Tuesday that it has captured the city of Kidal, a northern rebel stronghold.
the Malian army was able to capture this strategic town of these ex-separatist groups. And they captured Kidal thanks to the Bayraktar drones. And it was seen as a very significant victory for the military leaders in Mali.
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. Back to the war in Ukraine. There has been talk of a stalemate in the fighting, with experts predicting a long war, although many say Russia is gradually gaining ground. Let's hear from Tim again on how drones may have contributed to this situation.
Drones make everything visible. You can't hide very easily if you're actually moving around on the battlefield. That's very hard to do if you're being observed by drones which can report back and get the other side to shell you before you can attack. It's why Ukraine was able to blunt and halt Russia's main attack in 2022. And it's also why Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive wasn't as successful in pushing the Russians back as some in Kyiv had hoped.
Drones may have helped Ukraine at the start, but their wide use in this war has created difficulties for both sides and certainly added to Kiev's other worries. Enter Ukrainian resourcefulness. Margarita can tell us more.
Drones have always been important in this war, but they've become increasingly important recently, now that the war has reached a de facto stalemate. And moreover, Ukraine is now facing shortages of artillery ammunition and various kinds of weapons. And given the uncertainty over Western weapon supplies, Ukraine now has to rely on its own domestic production. So before the war, there are fewer than a dozen drone manufacturers in Ukraine, and right now there are close to 100. And the government is actively supporting this industry. It's allocated about $1 billion to support drone production.
В структурі Збройних сил будуть створені сили безпілотних систем. Відповідні пропозиції будуть...
In February, President Zelensky issued an order to establish this separate military unit, which would be specifically dedicated to drones. President Zelensky also said that in 2024, Ukraine would produce 1 million drones.
In addition to the top-down initiative, Ukraine has developed its own drone cottage industry.
Russia got better air defenses and it got better at shooting down the Bayraktar drones. So Ukraine had to evolve and rely on smaller drones, adapting commercial, recreational drones for military purposes. One of the most widely used models is the FPV, the first-person view drone, which is usually used for filming, but Ukrainians are equipping those drones with explosives, and they are now actively used on the front lines. Moreover, there are the famous drone kitchens, where essentially civilians assemble simple drones from the comfort of their home. And there are even startups that teach civilians how to make drones. When you watch Ukrainian TV, which is now dominated by the National News Marathon, you will see the QR code on the screen, and this QR code takes you to a page that collects donations for drones. And I think this is very telling because it shows that drones are now a priority, and drones are spoken about very affectionately.
Пташки українського виробництва. Розробляти ударні дрони військові почали
They're being described as little birds, ptashki, and I think this is also a kind of tribute to the drones, kind of a display of fondness for them and for the impact they are making. And one of the most innovative uses of drones in this war was in the Black Sea. Ukraine produced its own sea drones, and they actually damaged and even destroyed large Russian landing ships. Most recently, this was the Caesar Kunikov large Russian landing ship, and in total, 4 large Russian vessels were destroyed. And this actually changed the balance of power in the Black Sea. And Ukrainian officials always emphasize that this war is a war of technology. It's a war of brains, essentially.
When Russia took over Crimea in 2014, it laid hands on much of Ukraine's navy and port facilities. Kiev may only have a handful of ships now, but it claims to have managed to inflict disproportionate damage on the feared Russian Black Sea Fleet. At least 13 Russian ships are estimated to have been destroyed or damaged by sea drone attacks. Here's more from Tim.
In April 2022, Bayraktar drones were used reportedly in the anti-ship missile strike which sank the Russian cruiser the Moskva, which was the flagship then of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Now, they were used to provide guidance for the missiles that actually struck the ship. The Ukrainians were simply quicker than the Russians were in reacting. In August 2023, we saw Ukrainian drone boats attack Russian warships in Novorossiysk. It's become much more risky for Russia to deploy its high-value warships because they're very, very vulnerable to a drone boat. If you can take out a warship that might cost you $100 million, then it's obviously a win for the side deploying the drone boats. In December last year, the Ukrainians attacked a Russian landing ship, the Novocherkassk, in Feodosia. Ironically, it was reportedly carrying Iranian drones.
Our disinformation team has scrutinized these reports. They've gathered data on 350 drone attacks on Russia and Crimea in 2023. Here's Olga Robinson with more details.
Every single time we do analysis of a suspected drone attack, it essentially is like putting pieces of jigsaw together. When it comes to Black Sea Fleet, we know that in October, Russia moved parts of its Black Sea Fleet, some 300 kilometers, much closer to Russian mainland. That is and has been described as one of the successes of Ukraine in the past year.
The team has not only been looking into drone attacks in the contested waters of the Black Sea, they have been putting the locations on the map to see the reach within Russia too.
We've been trying to essentially understand the geographical spread of suspected drone attacks in Russia, what is being hit, what kind of damage we're seeing. In some cases, all we've got is statements from Russian officials or from the Russian Defense Ministry, and we can't really verify them, but we do include them in the tally because they help us build a picture of what is being claimed. The absolute majority of over 300 attacks that we saw just last year alone, it was really hard to pinpoint where it was launched from. Was it launched from Ukraine? Was it launched from inside Russia? Was it like some sort of partisans, or was it Ukrainian servicemen? When it comes to drone attacks elsewhere, I think it would be safe to say that drones in big Russian cities like Moscow, or certainly in the kind of areas closer to the border, like Belgorod, like Kursk, like Bryansk, which have seen dozens and dozens of attacks in the past months, they definitely have had at least psychological impact, because it does bring the idea of the war much closer to home. You know, when I talk to people back in Russia, I do hear them mention drone attacks or the fact that they've heard them. They now know how to tell the sound of a drone from a sound of a plane, and that's become like an everyday reality.
Drones have transformed warfare at a breakneck speed and claimed big wins. It's clear they're here to stay. So what does the future look like? Back to Tim and more on the potential of this technology.
Drones are going to be a fixture of modern warfare, and in future, artificial intelligence, AI, is going to be used with drones to increase their autonomous capability.
When you say AI, there have always been concerns of ethics in the use of drones in warfare, but the combination of drones with artificial intelligence in conflicts, this takes it to a whole new level, doesn't it?
Yes, you're right, it does. And this is, if you like, the new age of drone warfare, where we have drones combined with AI. Most modern militaries are shrinking in size because everything's incredibly expensive, and they're looking to technology to help bridge the gap. Drones give you an air force on the cheap, which is why many countries in Africa and elsewhere are beginning to use them. But combining that with AI systems which can help you sift through enormous quantities of data and find the enemy, That's really where we're moving to.
But just to clarify, we're talking about the development of drones that are able to autonomously attack targets themselves without instructions by humans. Is that the idea?
We're on the cusp of that, yes. And at the moment, most militaries still have humans in the loop. It's a human taking the decision. However, I have to point out the report from the United Nations on fighting Libya said that a Turkish-produced drone, actually a quadcopter, had been used in autonomous mode. In other words, they'd been programmed and then they'd been left to get on with it. It's all very opaque if you're concerned about the ethics of warfare, or quite simply the practicalities of a machine making a mistake.
I mean, this could be right out of a dystopian novel where artificial intelligence destroys humanity. How can such a scenario be avoided?
Regulation is possible. We can place limits on the use of AI and autonomous drones and keep a close human oversight of such systems. However, the very fact that we may have seen the first autonomous drone deciding on its own shows that the discussion on this issue is urgent and important, because the technology is certainly not going to wait for us to make up our minds.
Thanks to our contributors Tim Bowler, Margarita Maliukova, Lynette Bahati, Hilken Boran, Barry Sadid and Olga Robinson. The Global Jigsaw team is produced by Krista Shaturi, technical producer Elchin Suleimanov, and me, Krasi Twig. Our sound engineer is Nick Scripps, and our editor is Judy King. Thank you for giving us your time. Please let us know what you think at The Global Jigsaw, all one word, at bbc.co.uk.